So we've gone from kind of the big overview of what's possible, the great potential that we're on the brink of with the coming productivity boom, to a discussion about the future of work, what's possible, what some of the challenges are, and how we can engage, certainly on the education front, to prepare our workforce for the future. And now we're going to talk about some of the practical policy approaches to this new digital economy. And policy gets down in the weeds, and there are lots of differing perspectives, but we want to have a civil competition of ideas, and we're really pleased that we've got a great moderator who I'd like to introduce now, Mark Jamison from AEI. He came up from Florida, and Mark has had a great and long career. You can read about in his bio, as opposed to our other AEI fellow, Brett Swanson. Mark's bio is correct, but there's something really important about Mark that you all need to know. He is going to get married in 2.5 weeks. And when you think about what life means and what the fullness means, it is connecting. And marriage is at the core of who we are as humans. All of us come from the union of two people. That's how it happens. It's always fun to talk to my boys as they are growing up about the realities of procreation. But marriage is an incredible gift. It's taught me so much about myself and life, and so certainly we want to celebrate the marriage of Mark and Marilyn, right? So best wishes to you, Marilyn. And Mark Jamison, would you please come up and introduce the panel that we're having? Please welcome Mark Jamison.
Thank you, Jimmy. Appreciate it. Let me grab my paper here.
Oh, yeah, you're allowed.
Thanks. Well, first I'd like to thank Jimmy, the other people working in the Kemp Foundation, for the opportunity to chair this panel. As they indicated, we're at a remarkable point in our country where we can accomplish a lot of things if we can get our policies right, our people right, and get the skills in the right places at the right time. And excited to be able to have that conversation. We have an excellent panel to be talking about that with us this morning. We have Congressman Hurd. He's representative for the 23rd District in Texas. If you are familiar with that district or look at the map, you'll see it bridges all the way from San Antonio to El Paso. And if you think about the populations there, what the economy is doing, it is on the cutting edge, is on the edge of what is going on in this country. All the opportunities, all the challenges are exactly right there. He graduated from Texas A&M. He worked for the CIA in the Middle East, and so he knows what it means to be in a difficult place, not just Congress, but also a CIA in the Middle East. He's now on the House Permanent Select Intelligence Committee, so grateful to have him with us. We also have Chris Liddell with us as well. He's Assistant to the President and Director for the Strategic Initiatives in the White House Office of Innovation. He graduated from Oxford University, and if you look at his bio, he's been the CFO of General Motors, Microsoft, International Paper, executives in other businesses as well, so someone who understands what it takes for a business to be effective, to be innovative, to create value. He's the person who knows how to practice leadership in that environment, so we're really glad to have him as well. Then also we have Commissioner McSweeny with the Federal Trade Commission. She has served as the Chief Counsel for Competition Policy and Intergovernmental Relations with the Department of Justice. She was a Deputy Assistant to President Obama and a Policy Advisor to Vice President Biden as well. So we're really glad to have them. And I'm going to move up here and we'll get our conversation started. So our conversation so far has all been about innovation. It's all been about creating the future. And one of the things that I think strikes people sometimes is not only is innovation critical in the private sector, which we'll get to in our discussions, but it's critical in government. And sometimes government's the most challenged most challenged entity for that innovation, for getting the information technologies in the right places at the right time. And I just wanted to open that for the panel and tell us about how you think about what can we do in government to get government innovating in the right way. And I'd start with the Congressman. Do you mind?
Sure. I think we have to start with what is actually the problem, and I'll get into the weeds a little bit. The technical challenges that we face are all solvable, but it starts with having the right leadership in all these places. I spoke at an event yesterday, and the topic of the event was whether or not the federal government should move into the cloud. Hello, the cloud is not emerging technology, it's emerged, and we should be talking about how are we using artificial intelligence, how are we using machine learning on the data that we're doing. But we got to make sure the folks that make these decisions have the power and the tool to do that. And I'm speaking specifically on CIOs. And we also need to have people within these agencies that are focused on, and something I'm still Chris's line, citizen-facing services from these agencies. And you shouldn't have to get your passport, you shouldn't have to go to a post office to get your passport renewed, right? Can't you do it from the comfort of your own home? But we need to have people that feel empowered, and we need to have people that have the right skill sets to do this. We should be talking about blockchain, and how are we using blockchain in customs? How are we using blockchain in food safety? Instead of talking about technology that's 10, 15, 20 years old. And I think the role Congress should have is shining a light on all of these practices within those agencies. But it takes leadership. You know, I'm a big fan of Tony Scott, the former federal CIO. He was doing. Now we have Chris Liddell that really, and his office, that is making sure it starts from the top. Cybersecurity innovation is a responsibility of the C-suite, and those agency heads need to understand that. And if they don't, then Congress should be providing that oversight and making sure they're doing it.
Commissioner, eventually I'll go to you and I'll ask you to think about that with respect to your own agency. But let me start with the White House and how it's thinking about providing that kind of leadership. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, so just to build on the Congressman's comments, firstly, start with the opportunity. I've never actually seen as much opportunity for innovation as I see in the government and in the time that I've been here, which is relatively short. But one of the first things I did in the first month is go and meet with every CIO and talk to them about it, and talk to the other people like the ex-CIO, federal CIO. And there's a high degree of commonality on the what. What's missing is the how. And to build on the comments, firstly, leadership at the White House. We've created that with Jared Kushner, Office of American Innovation, myself, focusing through American Technology Council. So we've created a focus, but it's about organizing ourselves, focusing on the right things. We spend a huge amount of money on IT. Again, it's not a monetary issue. We spend $85 billion, and that probably understates it. So we spend vastly more per head than the private sector does, but we don't necessarily spend it in the right ways. So this is an issue of implementation. It's an issue of how, not what. There is a vast amount of innovation in citizen-facing services, in cybersecurity, in cloud-based services. There's innovation opportunities everywhere. What we need to do is be better organized to actually do it, and that's the focus that we're bringing from the White House.
Okay, great. And Commissioner, you've seen successes and failures, your time in the White House, now your time in an agency. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like to start by just saying thanks for having me. Obviously, I'm bringing a bipartisan flavor to this conversation, and I really appreciate both the willingness to have a bipartisan conversation on this topic. But I also think it underscores the fact that this is not a Democrat or Republican issue, that these are areas where we have a lot of consensus, and that's right. So I would say, building on what the Congressman just said, the important thing is that we are innovating in a sensible way. There's a huge amount of potential, but very often what we're missing in the government is the technical expertise. So one of the innovations that I am proudest of at the FTC, for example, is our creation of an Office of Technology Research and Investigation, our active onboarding of technologists and computer scientists into the work that we're doing, which is really beneficial not just in making sure we're making sensible decisions with our own IT needs, but that we're making policy decisions and law enforcement decisions that are informed by technical expertise about the technology we're talking about. Because too often the policy conversation or even the procurement conversation isn't as informed as it needs to be. And I think that's an area where we have a huge amount of consensus, and it's incredibly important to policymakers. So I like to see the continued support for that, and I think it's really, really important. You know, again, there's also a huge amount of data, for example, that the government has. And one of the things that I think was very successful that I hear, I think we are continuing in the Trump administration, is thinking about ways in which government data can be useful, and ways in which we should both protect the privacy of the people whose data it is, but make it available in a privacy protective way so that we can spur innovation. This is incredibly important, for example, if we're thinking about how to train the next machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies. There are huge data advantages out there in the marketplace, but we can make some of the government data available to help new entrants, but also some of the top innovators in the space.
I can just build on that, because I totally agree with it. What we've seen in citizen-facing services, if we focus on that aspect rather than the infrastructure that sits below it, we've made some progress in the government, but the shape of the curve, if you like, is less than in the private sector. So the private sector has been innovating faster than the public sector. So we've been making progress, but we're falling further behind. Part of the solution is obviously to get more agile in the way that we develop citizen-facing services. Part of it is engaging the private sector in a way to get the best of every mind in the country focused on it. So we have this disconnect. We're the leader in just about every form of technology in the country except government technology. So to your point, how do we open up data so that we not only have to build the things that we're building faster, but we encourage the private sector to access data and innovate in a way that will change the shape of the curve so that we're innovating at least as fast as the private sector.
But one thing that they both have touched on, it's something I spend a lot of time on, and when I first ran for office, I never mentioned these words, IT procurement, right? It is not a sexy topic, but when the people that are purchasing the IT goods and services are different than the people using the IT goods and services, you're going to have a disconnect. And I think if we look at where is innovation happening in the government quickly, I would always look to the intelligence services, small, nimble, special forces in the military, small, nimble. The people that need something are also the ones involved in the development of it. And so you see that the end user is pushing that. And that's not always the environment that we have in other parts of the federal government. And we have challenges in the way. I always talk about a cyber proving ground in San Antonio. The 24th Air Force, Congress gave the commander of the 24th Air Force up to $10 million to buy a digital tool that they need to defend their infrastructure. But the idea was, hey, we have a problem. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., everybody come in the room. We're going to draw it on the whiteboard. Whoever has a 15-day solution, a 30-day solution, 60-day solution, I have the money to buy it, right? It's like, hey, that's a great idea, except you have to have security clearance in order to hear that problem. And if you don't have an existing contract, you can't get a security clearance. And so the people that could ultimately probably have something on the shelf that can solve a problem, we can't get it in to the government. And so these are some of the barriers that we have to get through when you have the right leadership.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens with information technologies and making them customer-facing is that you have an opportunity to build trust and connection with the constituents that you have, but they, as the commissioner indicated, they also have to trust your keeping their information private, secure, not misusing it. How do you build that with our constituents?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. How about that?
Sure.
I mean, I think that we have really good frameworks that we can use to make sure that we are balancing privacy with also opening data, and we've articulated a lot of them. I don't think it's particularly controversial. And we also have the advantage of the research that's ongoing on the cutting edge of technologies like homomorphic encryption, where we can also access large amounts of information, compare and make inference from them, but keep the information fundamentally private as well. DARPA is doing terrific research on this. I think the government investing in research in this area continues to be incredibly important, not just in privacy protective technology development, but technology development in general, and how we can continue to open some of our data, but continue to be a cutting-edge investor in some of the newest technology and the newest capabilities around. So I would combine both of those things, and of course mention workforce and training is incredibly important as well. We have a tremendous natural resource in this country, in our civil society, in our research community. I work a lot directly with hackers. I think they're a tremendous resource, especially when they are white hat hackers. We had the pleasure of actually being at DEF CON together this year, the congressman and I, slightly different times, but I think both really experiencing and blown away by the capabilities that we actually have out there in our labor workforce, and making sure that we are mindful of those capabilities and harnessing those capabilities and coming up with creative ways to learn from them, I think is really, really important.
And part of the solution in my mind is bringing the best of government and the best of the private sector together to solve the problem. So we had a conference a couple of months ago where we brought in 20 of the biggest companies in the country. From a technology point of view, we split them into 10 streams. One of the streams was cybersecurity. So how do we bring the best practices from the private sector into the government? As a result of that, we wrote a report, 100-page report on how we actually modernize the government around cybersecurity and protecting people's information. And we opened that report up to public scrutiny. So we asked people to comment on it. So part of it is being transparent about what we are doing and making sure we have the best thinking coming in. And we had 100 companies actually comment on that report, and we're now digesting their information, putting it into the final report, and then implementing it. So if we can bring the best thinking from the private sector and have a open, transparent process where we bring that in and then have a formal structure where we actually implement the best recommendations, we've got the best chance of getting trust.
Trust is such an important word, especially now when there's a lack of trust in civil institutions. And I was in Estonia recently, and Estonia, every government service you can do online. And now, Estonia is only 1.3 million people in the entire country, which is basically the size of San Antonio. But it is, and they were able to do it because they have established trust with the people. And this is after some major attacks by the Russian government. So having that trust, and the way we do that within the federal government, you got to protect people's data. And the only way we're going to get there is following basic digital hygiene, and we're not. Most of the hacks that have happened, OPM, Equifax, these are not zero-day exploits, zero-day being a previously unknown vulnerability. These are basic things that we knew, and if we would have patched, we would have protected it. And so making sure that when it comes to securing our digital infrastructure, you're doing the basics. If you do the basics well, you're going to protect yourself from 85 and 90%. And that's how you reestablish the trust with the American people, and then you start having this liberal access to data and seeing what's going on and making sure there's transparency. That's how we reestablish that trust, and it allows us to start doing some interesting things.
You also need a system which is continuously responding to new challenges. So today's problem is not going to be tomorrow's problem. There'll be a new and different one. So you need to not only fix today's problem, you need a system which basically innovates continuously, and that's why you need to get the private sector and the public sector working together on best practices.
Well, we've brought into the discussion the private sector and its role within the space we've been talking about. There are a lot of controversial and difficult issues with respect to the technology firms, and do people trust them, do they not? Part of the discussion has been they have grown in tremendous sizes. The largest country in the world is now Facebook, 2 billion citizens of Facebook, if you will. Larger than China. If you add China, the US, and Mexico together, we're about the size of Facebook. So some people are concerned. What does Facebook know about me? How much power does it have? People have been concerned with things about Amazon and Google as well, with their magnitude, their size of things that they're doing. What are your thoughts? Is there a government response to this, or is it this is the natural pace of an industry that is evolving rapidly and taking advantage of its new economics? What are your thoughts in that space?
Well, look, we can't be afraid of technology, right? You know, we got to be ready to evolve, but we also have to understand what you're doing with it, right? You need to understand what information these tools have of yours, and you know, a lot of these debates degenerate down into privacy versus security, Right? I think you can do both. You can defend digital infrastructure, chase bad guys, and protect our civil liberties all at the same time. Our civil liberties are not burdens. They are the things that make our country great, and we should always be protecting them. And this debate is going to constantly happen whenever there's new technology. When quantum computing becomes a reality, we're going to have this debate again. But as users, we have to be aware of what tools are out there, and we have to know what information is there. Look, in schools, we oftentimes teach how an engine works, right, in a car, but are we teaching kids how the internet actually works? Right? Are we teaching kids how, how social, the fundamentals of why social media and why a company like Facebook has ultimately got to 2 billion users? We don't. And they need to have a better understanding of these things that are so ubiquitous in their lives. And I think when you have a better understanding of the tools and how they work, you also understand the challenges that are there.
Commissioner McSweeny, is that too close to your space of your actual work?
Yeah, well, our focus is really internal, and so the government should have its own standards on behaviour and how it uses information, and we should set those. But what the Congress says, we should have best practices from the private sector, but the way in which the policies and how we use information should be specific to the government.
I mean, I think I'll agree with what the Congressman said in terms of I think it's important to be really specific about the kinds of harms that we're concerned about, and to be mindful of the fact that we do have really good frameworks in place if we use them to provide appropriate checks and balances. So yes, I think that we can have privacy and security as long as we have appropriate oversight and get the balance right on that. But I do think that we are at an interesting inflection point. The technology companies that we're talking about, particularly the very large ones, are having a powerful impact on our lives and on markets and even on democratic institutions. So I think it's incredibly important for us to be mindful of the fact that I don't think we want to get rid of the notion of having major industries that are shaping all of our lives be accountable to democratic institutions. I think the Congressman is doing some really interesting work on this front when we think about the interference in our election process and the consequences of that for all of us. I think all of us should care very deeply about that. I deeply hope that we could have more bipartisan work together on privacy and data security legislation, because I think we're probably not in a very different place in terms of wanting to make sure that consumers actually have access to information, have maybe some rights to their data, have some ways to interact with the consequences of the technology in their lives that are a little bit more meaningful than the choices we're currently being offered. I would love to be able to teach my kids about what being connected to the internet means. I have kids, I'm raising them as digital natives, it's a challenge. I can't even tell them what it means because I can't tell them for sure unless I simply keep them off of a platform where their data goes any more than I can tell my mom where her data is going. And I think we are approaching a moment where there's certain situations where consumers are no longer comfortable with the trust us response on that. And we have to be mindful of that because consumer trust is a really important aspect of demand for new technology. And the last thing we want to do is create so much concern and fear out there that we aren't really getting the benefit of all of the technologies that are flowing into our lives. I don't think we should be anti-tech at all. I think we should be pro-innovation. We need to make sure that we're hearing and understanding, responding to some of the consequences of this innovation in our lives.
Yeah, look, there are we're focused on some of the social media firms right now, and a lot of that is because of the ads in our elections that the Russians purchased. But Equifax, nobody in this room opted in to give our information to Equifax. Nobody in this room opted in to any of the other credit monitoring companies. And that is a integral part to authentication, right? Identifying someone is indeed who we think they are. And that has been, that foundation has been broken. And so there wasn't a violation of the law, but nobody's been able to explain how did Equifax get all that information. There was no breach standards that were broken, and so I think this is going to be a case that I hope people have been poring over of how we got there and how we prevent that from ultimately happening. And we have to separate protecting information from disinformation, right? Or covert influence is how I would say that in my old job at the CIA. And how do you counter misinformation, disinformation, right? The Russians have been doing this for decades in Europe. They're going to continue to do that. We don't have a strategy on how to deal with disinformation. And so that is a broader question when the ability to touch an individual, it's so fast. You can touch anywhere, around the world. But we've dealt with this in other mediums, and we just have to adjust those tactics, techniques, and procedures into this new environment.
If I may, I mean, the way I like to think about this, and I come from obviously a law enforcement agency that oversees a lot of the technology we're talking about from a consumer perspective, is that I don't think it's going to continue to be acceptable for congressmen to ask a company why something happened and for the answer to come back, well, we don't really know, the technology just did that. And that's currently the answer we get some of the time. I think we were okay with that maybe for a while when we were talking about shoe advertisements following people around the internet. But we need to be mindful of the fact that the technology we're now talking about is predictive, it's powerful, and it's increasingly autonomous. And I think we as humans actually want to be in that conversation about what technology is doing, what decisions it's making for us, and whether we're okay with those decisions, or at the very least, how did it make those set of decisions? I mean, we're having a really active conversation about this right now in the use of predictive technology that's moderately intelligent in sentencing and criminal justice system. I'm deeply concerned about whether we have appropriate oversight by humans of that kind of technology, and I think it's a topic that we should all be talking about.
Let me take us just a little bit further into that space of innovation and talk about the entrepreneurs in the country. I'm struck, 90% of my work is trotting around the world working with people, but I also work with a lot of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds here in the U.S. I had a wonderful conversation, I think it was just yesterday, with one of my former students who's now in Silicon Valley, one of my current students, and they were trying to figure out what they could do in the cryptocurrency space together. That sense of entrepreneurship of the younger generation is just incredible, the things that they can do. What are the right government policies that should be in place to really let that entrepreneurship flourish, create the next economy for us?
I think the Office of American Innovation should start with that question.
Yeah, well, our focus is internal, so the federal system, and clearly there is a huge opportunity in terms of people building services on top of the government. So from an entrepreneurship, GovTech, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities we have. It's one of the least developed areas. So some of the other areas that people are focused on, like social networks, there are plenty of people in that space. There's not that many entrepreneurs building services for the government for the 320 million customers that we have. So in terms of the policies we need to do, we talked about continuing with an open data approach. The other point that we make, making it easier for people to actually contract with the government. One of the biggest pain points for small businesses is it's really difficult to contract with the government. It's expensive, it's difficult, and it's time consuming. So our contracting system unfortunately favors the larger companies in this thing. So we need to make it easier for small businesses to work with the government, contract with the government, and build services for citizens using the government system.
And stay out of the way, right? Let's not overly regulate something. Let's not get too far in the way. The example I use is everybody kind of knows what Ethernet is, right? The little Ethernet jack. But there used to be a thing called token ring, which did the same. And there were a lot of computers that had to have a token ring and Ethernet jack in it. It wasn't the government that decided that Ethernet was going to be the technology that everyone was going to use, right? It was markets that allowed that to happen. And I think sometimes being afraid of technology, you know, when some researchers were able to hack a car a couple of years ago, everybody wanted to react and knee-jerk reaction, like, oh my God. Well, it's still pretty hard to hack a car barreling down the highway at 90 miles an hour. Can it be done if you have complete access to something? Yes. Are these things that we should be mindful of as our car becomes a very large connected device? Yes. But we shouldn't be overly burdensome and let innovation grow. And then we also got to make sure that we've all said it, you know, education. And we look, a lot of states mandate that every school is supposed to have a computer science class. Only like 4% of high schools across the United States of America have a computer science class. And look, I took music when I was in school. I took history. I took a lot of math. I am neither a musician, mathematician, or you know, political scientist, right? But having exposure to these things, especially at a young age, and I'm working on trying to get this into middle schools and making sure 7th and 8th graders are exposed to coding. I think the sooner we get people exposed to it, the more that ember can potentially grow, and it not only make them a digital native with the tools, but also the programming and the details that go behind it.
I guess I would add, probably not surprisingly, that I think an open competitive marketplace is incredibly important. And one of the things that we're seeing increasingly that potentially threatens entrants and entrepreneurs is whether we really are adequately protecting an open marketplace. Strong antitrust competition enforcement is deeply important. I actually happen to believe that clear regulations to protect the open internet is a really important aspect of entrepreneurial activity in that space, especially. I would also add that government investment in research and development, especially in technology, is absolutely vital. We've seen over and over and over again the tremendous innovation benefit that flows from the US investing in a little thing called the World Wide Web. And I think that we need to be mindful of the fact that we have an excellent track record of trying to protect that space for innovation and invest in it and grow the new technologies. And so I would continue to encourage those policies as well.
Okay. Jimmy, our time is up. Could we take a question from the audience? I've monopolized things, or do you want to move on?
Take a question.
One question. Your hand was already up.
I have a question about stifling of innovation. In my experience, technology for archiving data that's non-magnetic will last a couple hundred years. CIA awarded me a contract to prove it worked. We proved it worked. The Library of Congress loves it. NARA loves it. All the Hollywood studios love it. I've spoken to everybody from Amazon to Western Digital and all the alphabet in between. And they view it as disruptive because they view it'll ruin their current business model. People having to keep migrating data endlessly, even in cloud storage and stuff like that. I'd love to have any advice on innovation there because we've proven it works and it's incredibly inexpensive. That's why they view it as disruptive. But it's literally, it survives benign to galactic and store it from 15 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Any suggestions for innovation?
So that sounded more like a statement and an advertisement than a question. but why don't you? I'm not. What's your question? Sorry.
So if I can't seem to get the existing stakeholders to want to step behind it because they view it, it's going to hurt their current business so they don't want to encourage it to be a success.
Again, it sounded like an advertisement for whatever you're doing. But I'm happy to take whatever the issue is, and if there's a specific blocking, then address it.
Kind of piggyback on that is that honestly, I'm just going to talk from an outsider's perspective. We're not talking about the fact that competition, actual free market capital competition, doesn't quite really exist in this country because we have the people who have already been in this space blocking innovation like this gentleman's out of the market because they have access to, no offense, the established, apparatuses. So as citizens, what Americans do is we innovate. So what is it that our private and or public and or people in the mix, how can we actually support that innovation so that we can actually push our economies forward?
I'll take that. Chris said it earlier. We have to, the way procurement laws are done are old-fashioned. And we should be able to make it easy for the proverbial two gals in a garage to be able to introduce technology into Fortune Zero, right, which is the government, largest entity in the world. And the way we do that is, as I said earlier, folks that are going to ultimately use that service being the ones involved in the purchasing decisions, streamlining the process so that you don't have to have 10 lawyers in order to develop the RFP. We got to stop having, when an RFP is submitted, that is actually the time you should be engaging with vendors to make sure their response to it actually meets the goals. So these are some of the things that we have to change writ large across the government. And if you, Liz, or you, Robert, have specifics of things that you've experienced in government procurement, let me know and say, hey, this is the barrier that I had. Because if you've had it, other people have.
Yeah, would love to hear those examples.
All right, so join me in thanking the panel for the work they did. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Good job.